Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video, I want to talk about the potential for mages on Shadowlands. Now, we are in the early version of the beta of the game, so there are still plenty of changes to come. However, I've been getting a feeling like I'm not really giving mages nearly as much credit as maybe they should be. This has been one of those classes that I've actually been omitting in most of my videos. One, mostly because there's not too many changes, at least in terms of the basic abilities, except for a couple weird ones from Shimmer to then changes to Fire, and of course G-Pi becoming a 15-second cooldown. However, I do want to take a look at mages yet again, because I know a lot of you guys are looking at this class for Shadowlands. Break down how I feel about them so far, as some of you guys have even asked me, are they going to be competitive with how amazing Fire is currently? Can mages stand toe-to-toe with some of the other class changes happening in the Shadowlands beta? I'm gonna break down mages spec by spec. So first of all, let's talk about Arcane. This is technically the one spec of mages I've gotten the most amount of changes, primarily with the different abilities that are getting either added or changed up for the spec in general, with higher ranks as you get into higher levels. First of all, the ability for Touch of the Magi is a baseline ability. Instead of becoming a talent, you can actually proc it on a specific enemy, build up a bunch of arcane damage into that one target, and have that damage splash out to nearby enemies. Should give Arcane an opportunity, and that's what it really is an opportunity. Not saying this is actually going to be this good, but it should give them an opportunity to cleave multiple targets after fueling a lot of their single target punchy damage into one enemy and having it splash onto a couple targets nearby. With this ability though being added, a lot of mages have tried using it for single target, which creates extra problems with GCD, with you self-buffing yourself multiple times over before you can really start slamming damage into the enemy. So this ability has a bit of a give and take system to it. Then we have a change to Arcane Power, the big bursty cooldown for your ability. It is now, instead of being a short CD of 1.5 minutes, now it's a 3-minute cooldown. It does last longer, so this ability is going to be your big combustion, and that's where it seems that Blizzard is taking all the mage specs. They are making Arcane Power a massive ability for you to press and to sink majority of your damage into. The weird thing about this is I kind of like the bursty playstyle and the short cooldowns of Arcane Mage, and this is going to be a little weird and something to get used to, but it's going to make all the other mages feel very similar to one another. The damage that you put out, whether you're Arcane, Frost, or Fire, you will have this cooldown that's going to have a couple minutes linked to it. We do get a nifty talent instead of Touch of the Magi to replace the talent. We actually get a talent that's very similar to the traits from BFA, where you normally would do extra damage with your Arcane Blast at a certain amount of mana, and below a certain amount that ability would be cheaper. Instead, this talent is kind of universal for all your abilities. It will make all your abilities do 8% more damage if you're above 70% mana, and below 70% you actually regen mana a little bit quicker. The biggest advantage to Arcane Mages is now that your Mastery applies damage increases to all your abilities, not just your Barrage and your Arcane Blast. So stacking Mastery for AoE might be an actual solid option. Your ability of Presence of Mind now holds 3 charges, so you'll be able to get 3 instacast Arcane Blasts, so hopefully that should make your burst shot rotation with Arcane Power a little bit easier to manage. But besides all these changes and other aspects that were given to mages in general, Arcane is still gonna play very similarly. So even though you got changes, I call them kind of quote-unquote changes because nothing really feels different. You're still gonna be pressing exactly the same buttons in a very similar fashion. Unlike some other classes that have had minor adjustments where your focus of your abilities, whether it's from passives or actives, pet damage or your personal damage, a lot of classes have gotten improvements where Arcane Mages are more or less the same. So if you've enjoyed the current playstyle of Arcane Mage, you might be happy where it's at right now, but if you're looking for something fresh, you won't really get too much. At least until you look at the legendaries, which do offer some playstyle choices, which is going to be exciting. And I think that's where most mages are going to get into. The playstyle of Arcane is going to allow for a missile-heavy playstyle if you choose to play that. Then there's also a couple traits that made it back from BFA, being added as a modified version of legendaries, usually in a stronger fashion, which again will feel more to the similar playstyles the mages have. With a long cooldown for Arcane Power, mages are going to have a very big blasty damage at the very opener. This front-loaded playstyle might make them a little bit more invited to groups because most of your damage will happen at the very start like every other class, instead of you having intermittent burst. Intermittent burst can be nice if you need a little bit extra power in the Mythic Plus situation, but like fire and like frost, you will have most of your damage happen with your one big button cooldown. So hopefully Arcane will at least create a bit of a niche in terms of single target bursty rotation, trying to nuke enemies down. With some of the changes you've gotten, hopefully it'll help towards the gameplay. The GCDs is something that Blizzard needs to consider, and I would love for them to take off certain abilities off of GCD, like Arcane Power for example. It would actually make the rotation so much smoother, and I think that's something the spec needs. Or find a way to combine certain abilities together. Imagine if you could use Arcane Power and a Rune of Power would also spawn under you if you were talented into one. Something like that would make certain aspects and using certain abilities together much easier playing Arcane. Changes to Mastery will hopefully make the spec relevant, especially for AoE situations. I've always felt that Arcane either has to really talent heavily into AoE or into single target to be competitive at either one, but going half and half never has been its strong suit. So hopefully we'll see a little bit more of a half and half playstyle and more opportunities for Arcane going into this next expansion, primarily for Mythic Pluses and raid situations, so you don't really feel like you get screwed over. I would very much like Arcane to be viable compared to Frost and Fire, but I guess time will tell, as this Arcane spec sometimes is good, sometimes it's not, depending on the balancing. So maybe this is where the tuning is going to be very important. As for Covenant abilities, I think the Arcane mages, most of them are gravitating towards the one from Maldraxxus, since your base ability of Arcane Blast is kind of where most of your damage happens. So going for a big Arcane Blast while also in a Necrolord form, giving a little bit extra cleave to your Arcane Blast, should probably provide the most amount of upgrade. But I'm hoping that maybe they will adjust some of the other abilities where Arcane Mage can take those handily without really having to feel like you're missing out on your biggest upgrade from one Covenant. Then we have the Frost Mage, which actually has 0 new changes. There is one change, I guess, that is new, and that's usually having to do with your Flurry ability. If you press Flurry as a proc on an enemy, it'll apply 2 stacks of a debuff on the boss, where your next 2 spells are going to be a crit. This can be consumed by other abilities, like your Elemental technically can consume those stacks, but as a mage, if you're able to get those stacks consumed with some of your other abilities, like Frostbolt or Ice Lance rather, maybe even Glacial Spike, then it will probably be better in terms of the output of damage. Besides that, Frost Mage is exactly the same as it was. There's really nothing new, and I was really hoping Frost Mages would get something new. Maybe it's just me looking at some of the other classes in the game, like Warlocks and Shamans, and seeing so many cool new changes happening to them. Hell, even Rogues have gotten updates to make certain specs like Subtlety more competitive and Outlaw a little bit more consistent. But I guess don't fix something that ain't broken, as Frost Mages have had a very smooth playstyle with not too much RNG involved, and they feel fairly okay to play whether you have an insane amount of gear or you don't. They generally have been the go-to spec at the very beginning of expansion, and they generally stay competitive towards the end, even if they're not top tier meta spec by any measure. So Frost Mages are looking more or less the same as they are right now. Where I think the fun with Frost Mages is going to be is with your legendaries. You actually have some cool combos, and some of the different talents synergize with legendaries really well, especially the spec specific ones. There's one that I have right now on for most of my time that I'm spending my time playing my Frost Mage, is a legendary where upon using Frozen Orb, I get constantly a bunch of charges of icicles with Fingers of Frost, and all that does quite a bit of damage. Combining a couple talents that allow me to stay in my Icy Veins a lot longer every time one of those things crits, and then you can extend your burst rotation quite well. This legendary also adds an extra effect where Frostbolts can reduce the cooldown of your Frozen Orb, so playing around Frozen Orb even if you don't have the traits from BFA is still going to be somewhat of a possibility with Frost Mages going into the next expansion. Overall, it feels quite good to play, and there's going to be quite a few things that you can play with, mostly from your legendaries and external effects. Maybe there'll be trinkets and certain stats that you might play into. But this spec is going to be very much a plain Jane, but that's not always a bad thing. I'm hoping some of the different playstyles from some of the different pieces of gear that you can get for your Frost Mage is where it's going to be at. As for some of the other legendaries, there's some potential with PvP, so maybe Frost Mages could come back in PvP, as you can get a legendary to Nova people in place, and they can't break the Nova unless they trinket, Cloak of Shadows, immunity it, or get dispelled. So kiting melees and other casters to root them and slam those ice lances into the enemy could be a possibility, which is always exciting. As for some of the Covenant abilities, I don't really know which ones fit the Frost Mage the most. The Carrion can synergize well into the PvP playstyle with all your lances, but it can also synergize if you go for a Glacial Spike build. The Maldraxxus one could be decent, but I don't really see a Frost Mage's hitting Frostbolt nearly as much. It's mostly Ice Lance and going for big Ice Lance damage, but maybe that'll change with the balancing tuning at a later time in BFA. You could also go for the Venthyr, but that one seems to not be that good in PvE. Hopefully that ability will get a rework. And then finally we have the Ardent Wield ability, which does a bit of AoE damage with nature, not like Frost lacks any, but the cooldown reduction on some of your hefty long CD abilities is quite nice. So at least it seems like you have some viable options as a Frost Mage, no matter which way you slice it. And then we got the king themselves, the Fire Mage, and I believe, if I'm not wrong, they have been top tier specs since most of BFA. I believe they started being really incredibly good, or at least a viable alternative, like a really strong viable alternative, around BOD. I remember Frost Mages were still a strong meta, but Fire could make massive plays there. By Palace, they were slamming their heads against the keyboard with Master Blaster playstyle, bunch of pyros everywhere, and they allowed to have been literally the king of the expansion for as long as I can remember. Have Fire Mage's king status been challenged by the other specs in Shadowlands so far? This is beta, so this is early, but it doesn't seem like Fire Mages are bad, but it also doesn't seem that Fire Mages are top tier either. So it feels like all mages, maybe besides Arcane, feeling like it's a little bit lower on the bracket compared to the rest of the specs. It seems that Fire and Frost at least are looking quite competitive to one another, or at least very close, so it's really hard to judge. Now the numbers are not finalized again. Blizzard could make a bunch of changes, and some of the biggest changes that Fire has gotten is how they spread ignites, being with Phoenix Flames. It is cool to have an extra ability added on your bars, but not having your mastery spread naturally like it used to does feel a little bit weird when you're just so used to letting it go like wildfire, and now you're having to control it more, which I like the extra button that I could press as a mage, but it does also feel a little bit weird when you actually use it. But in single target, it's an extra ability for you to get a 100% crit, as Phoenix Flames functions exactly as it would, let's say, as a talent. So that also offers an opportunity for Fire Mages to get something cool in the talent row as well. Hey, more abilities being added back is never a bad thing. As for single target damage and AoE damage, Fire feels very, I'd say, familiar, besides all the Master Blaster playstyle that you're able to play with. So as you get your conduits and as you upgrade your conduits and with your legendaries, I think you'll be able to form certain playstyles, but it's definitely going to be a shell of what the original playstyle was for mages. There are some interesting similar mechanics, like you can kind of get a pseudo Master Blaster going. You can get a conduit where during combustion, using Fire Blast does increase the fire damage you do for a limited amount of time, and you kind of want to juggle this buff. So you can have similar playstyles, but I don't think it's going to have the severity, nowhere near close the amount of severity that it had in BFA. Which does mean that you might actually be open to more talents to play with for different playstyles. For example, everybody loves dropping massive meteors on top of our enemies, but Pyroclasm could now have a legitimate playstyle and legitimate use, which could be exciting. Maybe some of the talents in some of the other rows could now have viability because of a few changes to the playstyle that the Fire Mages have gotten with Shadowlands thus far. And then of course you have legendaries, which for Fire Mages are going to be the spice of life. I think they're going to give you a little bit extra for your playstyles. Whether you want to have a controlled playstyle where you actually control the playstyle for your legendary setup in terms of the abilities and the procs that you will get, or you can go completely uncontrollable fire blazing away at your enemy if that is how you choose to play your Fire Mage. So at least there are a lot of options. So if you're planning on checking out Mage and maybe even maining Mage for the next expansion with our early beta predictions, how is it looking so far? Well, I won't say that Mages are bad by any measure. I mean, they're not going to be like Warlocks at the beginning of BFA where they were basically replaceable until they got giga amounts of destruction burst damage. Mages are going to have a spot, well, off the bat, because they need to bring an intellect buff to their group. The intellect buff is going to be necessary for raids, and it's a useful utility to bring into dungeons as well. The mobility of Shimmer will still give mages this mobile playstyle that allows them to kind of be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The changes to Arcane, Frost, and Fire are made so that the specs have very, very similar playstyles to one another in terms of the big, massive cooldowns that they get to play with, as well as the utility they bring. The extra defensiveness of Time Warp is going to allow mages to have a little bit extra maneuverability around the game, but also have an extra defensive for you to slot in when it comes to dealing with burst pressure from mechanics like dungeons as well as raids. And that's going to be kind of like a temporal displacement for an auto talent, but brought into the base toolkit for mage, which is always a nice choice. Time Warp is still going to be huge, as mages are going to have a little bit extra value on the fact that they bring Bloodlust to the group, as well as all the other utilities they had prior, Spellsteal and slows and shields. But also the legendaries will give them a little bit extra of that punchy power, or if you want to go for some cheesy plays, rooting enemies and having that root not break ever could deal for some insane plays in Mythic Plus content. Or at least I'm guessing it could be, because I haven't seen anybody use it yet, but being able to root enemies with no way for them to break those roots, for a Frost Mage for example, being able to go for 2 charges of that root, then go for Cold Snap for another charge right after, just controlling enemies the whole time, could be quite advantageous. I'd say mages are looking quite good, and then if you're asking yourself, are they going to be competitive with some of the meta specs? Like I've got some of you guys asking, are mages going to be competitive with demon hunters and rogues? I think mages are going to go through the same growing as other classes that are casters have at the very beginning of the expansion, where at the start of every X-Pack, generally the melee classes have a much easier time dealing with mechanics and being brought into dungeons. But I think casters are still going to have a little bit extra of that punchy power, and you'll at least bring one of them with a couple melee mythic pluses. You definitely want to stack full of casters inside of raids in order to give a little bit extra value. But this is going to be a lot more helpful for any of you looking at mages if you're not too peculiar about which spec you want to play. If you are fine and you want to change out from Frost to Fire to Arcane, whichever spec is going to give you the best performance, then I think you're going to be in a fine spot. But let's say you're someone who is a person of clear taste. You like a certain playstyle, whether it's the frosty slows or the big combustion crits fire, or the slow and meditative playstyle of Arcane. As someone who's really looking forward to playing Arcane, particularly Arcane in the next expansion, and if Blizzard maintains more or less same balancing they've done for the 3 specs so far, right now if I were to just stick with Arcane and main Arcane, I wouldn't have the lack of confidence going into this expansion feeling like I'm going to have to switch my spec at one point or another just to retain viability. I feel that all mages are doing pretty good. Again, early beta, so maybe my predictions are a little too early. However, I do feel confident in being able to pick one spec and sticking with it, no matter what covenant I end up going for mages, as I'm just exploring a variety of options. But if your question was, is mage going to be a bad as a class, depending on the spec you play, or whatever spec you end up playing, I think mages are going to be just fine going into the next expansion. But at least that's where I would put them, at least so far. Of course, the next build could ruin them completely or make him even better, who knows. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Hopefully this answers some of you guys' questions about mages and Shadowlands, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.